Behind me is the old rock Tooele County Courthouse, which was built in the 1860s. And from 1874 to 1879, it was the seat of government of an unrecognized ephemeral country called the Tooele Republic. And as the story goes, the first people who were non-Mormons to settle in this area, the first actual white settlers, they were miners, they were soldiers, they were people who came with Patrick Edward Connor, and they came because of the Civil War. Connor was charged with setting up Camp Douglas, and because all of his soldiers were only in California for the gold rush, he said, well, in your off time, you should go up to the mountains and try to stake a claim. Well, they discovered gold, and by the 1870s, they had huge mines operating out of South Tooele County.
That lasted until the Civil War, because a lot of the Civil War robbed the soldiers that were down at Camp Floyd. So they went ahead and disbanded at the time, but soon followed were the California Volunteers, led by Philip Connor. I think it was Colonel Connor at the time. And he brought over a lot of his volunteers who happened to be miners at the time. While they're out in Utah, they didn't have much to do. They helped with the California Trail and escort people across the California Trail. But also, while they're bored, they noticed that the local native population, the Indians, had metal ore. Somehow they got that ore. Found out from the Ochre Mountains that there was a lot of mineral deposits up there. So them being miners, started mining across there and soon established the Stockton District, the Mercer District, the Sunshine District of the Ochre Mountains, and started building the mines across there. They were based out of Fort Douglas, Camp Douglas at the time, but they had definitely a hobby with the mines. Made the smelters around there. There are some charcoal kilns that they used to fuel the smelters, and eventually made some smelters in Salt Lake and eventually here in Tooele also.
The Benson Grist Mill is a fascinating example of a very early building in Tooele County. It was built in 1854, and at the time it was the county seat. It was called Richville, and this was basically, it was wrapped up in the Indian Wars, and you had the ghost shoot around here. And Richville and Benson Grist Mill, they were the headquarters of government in this remote part of Utah, not too far away from Salt Lake City, for a number of years. And it's really nice how well this has been maintained. And only a few years after this was declared the county seat, the military would move in with Johnson's expedition and the Utah Wars. And it was shortly after this that Tooele City in the 1860s was declared the seat of government for Tooele. And shortly after that, the Tooele Republic would emerge. A fascinating example of what amounted to a corrupt political coup, declaring itself independent and sucking dry the banks. And it's interesting to think that this grist mill saw all of these political changes actually happening. It actually saw the Liberal Party and the Progressive Party, the Liberal Party being the mining interests and the Progressives, the LDS church interests, basically battling it out. No bloodshed as far as I can tell, but this area was here before the establishment of Camp Floyd, or at the time it would have been called Camp Crittenden, and it stayed here up until nowadays. And this is one of the oldest buildings, and very weirdly, it's kind of often overlooked in tours of Utah, historic tours, but it's one of those that really needs to be shown. And if you look around, they've got old cabins and homesteader sites and barns, but this is the only site that truly originates here. And immediately over to our left, you've got the valley where the ghost shoots were, the Skull Valley area. And that kind of caused a little bit of conflict between settlers and the early Native Americans. Ahead of me now is the old commissary for Camp Floyd, and the camp began in the late 1850s as Camp Crittenden, but it was named after the Secretary of War. And when the Secretary of War went to join the Confederacy, they renamed it Camp Floyd. It was a 100-plus acre camp stretching out directly in front of me. And this really annoyed the LDS people because they saw it as a sort of den of snakes, founded under false pretexts. The story goes that because Utah was a territory, Washington, D.C. sent in a few officials, and they came here to find out that Brigham Young had basically all the power. So a few months later, these officials went back to Washington, D.C., and there were conflicting reports over whether they'd been run out or whether they just left out of protest. And in response to this, because there was a lot of anti-Mormon sentiment at the time, the Army sent out 1/3 of their men to Utah, and they got here quite a ways away from Salt Lake City to establish a fort. And the reason they were so far away from Salt Lake is because they kind of understood there is no rebellion happening. And so this fort grew up and became what they called Frogtown, because the soldiers here were not Mormons. They would drink because it was incredibly boring living out on the Great Plains, and there were brothels, there was a railroad, and quickly they discovered gold, and this opened up Utah to non-Mormons, people who brought in what the Mormons viewed as a bad lifestyle into their small community. So basically in 1861 this camp was emptied out, and they had to go just to fight in the Civil War. So once this camp was emptied out, it became, again, just a mining area with no soldiers, and a lot of shootouts happened here. It truly was the Wild West, and in the cemetery on the outskirts of town, we have a lot of graves left over from these, hostile years. And I mean, even here we see a bullet hole in this old stagecoach inn. And so on the dawn of the Civil War in 1861, this camp is emptied out and soldiers go their own ways, either to help with the Indian Wars and Patrick Connor, or to go fight with the Confederacy. A lot of the men did that. And then a lot of the people who had sprung up in this town, Frogtown, they stayed if they weren't in the military. It was an area of brothels, of outlaws, and especially of miners. You had hundreds of thousands of sheep, you had railroads, you had miners, and this was all something that the Mormons just were not used to. And this would develop into a split. And basically in Tooele, and in these areas of remote, kind of central western Utah, you had a unique Western culture develop alongside the Mormon culture and not interacting with it. And they had their own political parties, which eventually formed what amounted to a republic in the early to mid 1870s. And around me are the graves of people that died at Camp Floyd. Generally, from what I've been told at the state park, is that a lot of these people got into bar fights, or they were German Americans or immigrants who came to join the army and gain citizenship, and they were rough and tumble young men. They got drunk, they fell into the river, and they were buried, about 30-something of them, at this cemetery out here on the Great Basin. And this is the start of what you would call a totally different culture and grouping of people in this part of Utah.
So that attracted a lot of Mormons, the Gentiles as they call them, over on the southern part of Tooele Valley, over in that district. So that eventually led to politics, which led to the Tooele Republic, where there was enough of a population of non-Mormons against the Tooele Mormons, and they took over the politics for a few years until, from what I understand, they ran the banks, their deposits dry, and eventually vacated the area. But
so that was what it was, is the Gentiles, the miners, wanted more say in what was happening in the county. And Ophir, Stockton, Mercer were all mining communities. Jacob City, kind of the four towns there right in the mountain, I guess I used what you put it, but so they wanted more say than what happened here in Tooele and Grantsville and E.T. City and Lake Point. And so they ran their own, for county offices, they got their men that wanted to run for office, and they were running against the incumbents. Well, they knew they probably couldn't win. The state of Utah had a law that said that you had to live, in 1870, you had to live in Utah for 6 months before you could vote. which the libertarians, which was the Gentiles, did not break that law. They just brought people from all over Utah to vote. They weren't breaking the law. It was, but they offered free drinks, which was not ice water or milk, to anybody that would come down and vote. And they actually would bring stagecoaches in. They came down from Corinne, on the city of Corinne, all these men to vote. Women couldn't vote, so they would bring them down, gave them a nice drink, and then they voted. Well, they were going to vote for the Libertarian, of course. So when it was all said and done and they counted the ballots, there were more people voted for the Libertarians than lived in the county. But the Libertarians won legally because they had only asked people to vote if they had lived here for 6 months. The incumbents were up in arms. That just did not sit well, that they had got swindled quite so bad. And so they took over this city hall.
So now you had a budding head-to-head political toe-to-toe competition between the People's Party, which was the mouthpiece for the LDS Church, and what they had freshly created for the miners, the Liberal Party, which was the mouthpiece of the non-LDS Gentiles, the miners, the businessmen, the out-of-state people who came in to turn a profit. And so they rigged the election. They had a governor of Utah, which was pro-Liberal Party because he was a federal appointee who was opposed to the LDS Church. And then you had judges coming in who were also federally appointed. So they approved of the election, even though out of a possible voting number of people of 1,500 in the county, 2,200 votes were cast. They approved the election on a federal level, and Brigham Young kind of let it slide until the territorial legislature could correct for this discrepancy. They said you had to be a taxpayer, but the governor said the fact that they've paid the poll tax is enough. So they counted those votes as proper. This government, this Tooele Republic, lasted 1874 to 79 until it could be corrected. And the only real remnants of it now is the Tooele County Courthouse. And when the new government of Tooele Republic came in, the incumbents, the people of the People's Party, they refused to leave. So the sheriff held up in there with his box of ballots, refusing to let them in until orders came down from Brigham Young that you have to open it up and let these new politicians in. And then when they were kicked out in 1879, you had the same thing happen in reverse, where the Liberal Party refused to leave with their box of ballots. But of course, they went the wayside, and they only ever got a few more people elected in Ogden, which itself was a railroad mining community. This is a blip on the radar of Utah's political history, an independent state that existed in the mining communities of Tooele, which wasn't really able to govern itself because its politicians primarily were only experienced in mining and business.
So they actually went to Brigham Young and complained about this. Now, the elections were in November, and they went to Brigham Young to complain about this, and he could see that it was a swindle, but it was legal. It was deceitful, is what it was. It was deceitful. But he told the guys, the incumbents, give it up, give them the books, and we will rectify it in the next election. So when they went to the state Senate, Congress, they changed the writing of the law, that you had to live in the county that you were voting in, not in the state. Back then, should clarify, it would have been territory, because it was not a state. And so you had to live within the county of the territory that you were voting, so that couldn't happen again.
So the LDS party is the one that holed up inside of the courthouse.
For a short amount of time, yes, and took the books, and then they gave them all back. And when Brigham Young, who was over the LDS people, said, nope, that they won, give it to them, and then we'll fix the problem with the next election. So it was only for a matter of weeks that they held up and wouldn't give them the books. So it wasn't this standoff for years. And so the Libertarians took over, and ran the county for the next two years. And then there was another election, and the LDS people won. Because the others did not have the population to swing the ballot like they did. Then they held up in the county, in the building, and didn't want to give the books to the LDS, so each incumbent didn't want to share what they had. So
But there were no shots fired, no deaths.
no deaths, no shot. A lot of angry words, a lot of arrows of angry words, but there was no deaths. And it was proven, besides bringing people in, I laugh now because I kind of see with U.S. history happening at this moment. They came in with the county in very good financial status. There was money in the bank, everybody was doing good. When they left, we were like $12,000 in the hole. They were minors, they were not politicians. They did not know how to manage money and to do what a county was supposed to be doing. I don't know what they did in the county back then, but they spent all the money and then some.
And $12,000 in the 1870s.
Was a hunk of change for a county to have.